Merhaba, iyi akşamlar.
Açayım bir dakika. Başlıyorum. Sesim geliyor mu acaba?
Evet.
Tamam. Değerli konuklarımız, bu sene düzenlediğimiz Nafi Baba Tasavvuf Konuşmaları'nın 3.'süne hoş geldiniz. İçinde yaşadığımız pandemi koşullarının nadir iyi taraflarından biri, bize bu sene dünyanın farklı köşelerinden konuşmacıları kolaylıkla konuşmacı olarak çağırma imkanı vermesi. Geçen sefer Amerika Birleşik Devletleri College of William and Mary'den Ayfer Karakaya Stamp'ı dinlemiştik. Bugünkü konuşmacımız Maxime Durocher ise bize Fransa'dan katılıyor. Kendisi konuşmasını İngilizce yapacağı için ben de izninizle bu noktadan sonra İngilizceye geçeceğim. Dear guests, welcome to the third of our Nafi Baba lecture series on Sufism. I was just saying that one of the rare good things to come out of the pandemic this year is the opportunity to have here speakers from all over the world or from many parts of the world. Last time we had listened to Ayfer Karakaya Stamp, who joined us from the US, and today we have Maxime Durocher from Sorbonne University in France. If I may begin with a personal remark, it is a particular pleasure to introduce Maxime Durocher today. I had the pleasure of meeting Maxime in 2017-2018 when we were both research fellows at the Alexander von Humboldt College for Islamicate Intellectual History at Bonn University, at Bonn. In fact, we shared an office together. This experience enabled me to learn a lot about his research, his fascinating research on the architecture and archaeology of dervish lodges in the countryside of late medieval Anatolia. So, in fact, we were planning to invite him as a speaker to the center for quite some time. He was, I think, first supposed to join us physically 2 years ago when we first started out at the center. Then last year too, that didn't happen because of an illness. and then he had his baby. And ironically, this time the pandemic has enabled us to make this possible without Maxime undertaking the trip. And joining us virtually. So we're very, very glad about that. So let me just say a few words about Maxime Durocher's biography. Maxime Durocher received his PhD in Islamic art and archaeology at Sorbonne University in 2018. And I'll please excuse my terrible French pronunciation. His dissertation Zaviye, Sufi dans le pont intérieur des Mongols aux Ottomans, contribution à l'étude des processus d'islamisation en Anatolie médiévale, was finished in 2018, and it was awarded the Best Dissertation Prize by the Middle East and Muslim World Scientific Interest Group in 2020. And 3 years before that, in 2017, Durocher was also awarded the Brill Publishers' Best Paper Prize in Architectural History, together with Polina Ivanova, who I'm proud to say is also a graduate of our university, my very own history department, several years earlier. And she just finished or is about to finish her PhD at Harvard. So Maxime Durocher has held numerous grants and postdoctoral fellowships. In the name of saving time, I won't give you a full list. And since 2019, he has been working as an assistant professor of Islamic archaeology at Sorbonne University. He has also already published the results of his research in the form of several articles and book chapters. Again, in the name of saving time, I won't give you a list. The title of his talk today is The Many Lives of a Rural Sufi Shrine, Archaeology and History of the Zaviye of Sheikh Nusret. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Maxime, for being with us today and sharing your research. So with that, I stop and mute myself and let you speak.
Thank you very much, Darine, for your very kind and nice introduction. It's actually a real pleasure to be here. Actually, after two tentatives in real, finally it happens virtually today. Should I start sharing the screen? Yes. Nope. I think. Yeah, it is working. So I first would like to warmly, is the sound okay? Just tell me if, okay, thank you. So I first would like to warmly thank the Nafi Baba Center for Sufism for your invitation, and particularly Darine Terzioglu for a very kind introduction. I'm very honored to participate to this year's lecture series on Sufism, and also very happy to see research going on despite the general context. So let me start my presentation. I hope I won't be too long, and please forgive my English quite broken for not having practiced much because of the lockdown during the last months. So I'll start with the quotation of Evliya Çelebi, who writes in its mid-17th century travelogue, described a wealthy shrine in the vicinity of Zile in northern Anatolia as follows. This is the quotation you have on the screen. Sorry. So in the valley of Zile is a large inhabited and cultivated teke with an imaret, a mesjid, and an hospice, which is called Mizafir Khane in Evliya Çelebi's text. There live 70 dervishes, barefoot and bareheaded, and this community are the followers of Sheikh Nusret. While the number of 70 fukara, or dervishes, is most certainly a literary topos, Evliya Çelebi's testimony reflects the importance of the dervish lodge founded by a certain Sheikh Nusret in a village known in medieval sources as Aksara. Located in what is now here, around Zile, located in what is now a quite remote village, renamed Sheikh Nusrettin Köyü after the saint name, the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret has a long history, starting with its foundation in the 14th century and continuing until the 19th century, early 20th century. Indeed, more than 2 centuries after Evliya Çelebi, several European scholars, such as Henri Grégoire, John Anderson, and Frederick William Hasluk, that you probably know, visited the shrine during their expeditions in Anatolia. Their curiosity was driven respectively by the late antique history of the village, or the development of ambiguous shrines shared between Christian and Muslim communities, and they paid little attention to the Zawiya itself. However, they are the last external witnesses of Sheikh Nusret Dervish Lodge, still inhabited by a Sufi community a couple of decades before its closure, most probably in the 1920s. Little remains of the flourishing complex as it is described by the Ottoman traveler during the 17th century. In the middle of a large wall enclosure, witnessing the wealth of the teke, stand 2 buildings erected at different times. You can see the plan here. The first, on the east, is a square domed mausoleum built in rubble stone and hosting the cenotaph of Sheikh Nusret and 2 of his descendants. This structure is, as we shall see, uneasy to date precisely, but was certainly built between the late 14th century or early 16th century. On the west end stands a later wooden mosque built in the mid-19th century, so you can see an exterior view here. Between them, a storage room comprises the basis of the modern minaret, here in the middle, and it is a quite recent adjunction. Finally, on the northern side, a transversal loggia runs along the complex, which, as you can see, is quite a a really rural and not impressive one. And this loggia is composed of a platform nowadays used as a prayer place during the pilgrimage days to the mausoleum. Like the mausoleum, the building chronology, the building sequence of this platform is quite difficult to establish. Combining material evidence, epigraphy, and textual sources, my talk today aims to reconstruct the material history of these rural Sufi shrines and its significance in a longue durée perspective. The architecture of dervish lodges in medieval and, in a lesser extent, in Ottoman Anatolia is still poorly understood, lacking the monumentality of other institutions such as mosques or madrasas. Dervish lodges were for long excluded from a typological approach of Islamic architecture. It is only in the past 2 decades that pioneer works, such as Sarah Wolper's, has drawn attention on this category of institution during the medieval period. However, these works, following a general scheme in the history of architecture in the region, focus on the urban context, leaving aside the countryside, where architectural remains are often less monumental and particularly challenging to read. Some exceptions, like the shrine of Seyyid Batal Ghazi or Hajj Bektash, benefiting from elite patronage in the Ottoman classical age, so to speak, have recently been fully discussed by Zeynep Yürekli. Moreover, as it has been clearly demonstrated by Yürekli, or more recently by Çiğdem Kafesçioğlu for the so-called T-shaped mosque or Iwan mosque in Ottoman cities, the architecture of dervish lodges and their functions were constantly redefined. Like Sufi communities and their audiences, always redrawn over the years, dervish lodges were plastic buildings, adapting to new functions and needs. This constitutes a complete challenge for the archaeologist or the historian of architecture, too often in search for the original layout of the building and too often disregarding the afterlives of monuments. Putting forth a long-term perspective and cross-cutting textual sources and architectural remains offers a possibility to step aside and to understand the different phases of these evolutions. This methodology also enables us to write a material history of Sufism that includes lesser-known remains or lesser monumental remains, such as the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusrat that you can see on the screen. Absent in the general history of Anatolian Sufism, the Lodge of Sheikh Nusrat was nevertheless commented by local intellectuals such as Halit Chal, Bekir Altendal, or Emine Hakin, and other researchers from Tokat recently. These publications are still quite descriptive, but they were crucial to identify some of the textual sources related to the shrine. Indeed, a corpus of documents, including Vakfiye, Tahrir Defter, or tax register, and even an Ottoman hagiography, is related to the shrine and help us to contextualize its architectural remains. Despite some chronological gaps, the relative continuity of the documentation is unique and enables us to reconstitute, like a stratigraphic sequence, the history of the shrine and its significance, between the 14th and the 19th century. As we shall see, shedding light on the many lives of the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusrat unveils an important locus of devotion that played a significant role in the economic, social, and religious life of northern Anatolia. With this case study, I will try to highlight 2 crucial dimensions of rural Sufi shrines. Firstly, I aim to illustrate how the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusrat capitalized the period and how such donations were legitimized by the writing of the Vita of the Saint during the Ottoman period. Secondly, I will highlight the formation of local Sufi networks around the community founded by Sheikh Nusrat during the late medieval period and how these networks were perpetuated until the 19th century. My presentation today will then be organized in 3 times, following the life and afterlife of the shrine on a chronological perspective. In the first part, I will discuss the foundation of the shrine and the formation of the economic and religious networks during the second half of the 14th century. In the second part, I will turn to the Ottoman period and focus on an unpublished hagiography of Sheikh Nusret. This text includes a fascinating foundation myth of the Zawiya that echoes the history of the shrine reconstructed in my first part. Finally, I will address more briefly the 19th century history of the shrine, when it was largely restored, including a junction of fascinating wall paintings. So let me turn to my first part. The Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret is located in the Zile Plain, some 7 kilometers in the southeast of the city, so that is in northern Anatolia between roughly Amasya and Tokat. It is almost equidistant from these 2 cities, Amasya in the north and Tokat in the west. Nonetheless, the actual village of Sheikh Nusret in Köyü is rather isolated, apart from the main road of the region. This situation, so here is the village of Aksaray where the Zawiya stands. So this situation, this remote situation, does not reflect the historical roads. As you can see, an attempt to reconstruct this road. Sheikh Nusret Lodge was actually constructed here on one important road relating Amasya to Sivas, and that was actually the line of communication followed by Evliya Çelebi or Henri Grégoire, previously mentioned. The history of the site where the Zawiya was built dates back at least to the antique period. Several remains, as you can see here, we are like 200 meters to the north of the complex, including a 2nd century funerary stela, can still be visible in the village. More importantly, Grégoire has identified the village, known in Ottoman sources as Kırklar, literally the 40, as you all know, as the late antique settlement of Sarin. Sarin is one of the possible burial place of the 40 martyrs of Sebast. These 40 soldiers converted to Christianism were drowned in a lake in this region in the early 4th century. And their cult was particularly important in the late Antique and Byzantine period all over the region. Remains of this late Antique settlement, like spolia, as you can see here on the right inside the 19th century mosque, or outside the mausoleum here on the left. So remains of this late Antique settlement can be seen in the fabric and the surrounding of the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret. These were probably taken from a monastery or a martyria built there during the late antiquity. Nevertheless, the history of Sarin and Sheikh Nusret in Köyü between the 4th century and the foundation of the Dervish Lodge in the 14th century is totally unknown. And there isn't enough material evidence to prove that the Zawiya is the result of the conversion of a pre-extant Christian building, as it was once suggested by Grégoire or Asluk. More generally, the material remains of the medieval shrine founded by Sheikh Nusret are scarce and do not allow for a precise reconstruction of the original layout of the shrine. Moreover, no foundation inscription is preserved. Establishing the exact date of construction of the shrine is then like a Lego game where construction bricks are to be found in epigraphy, documentary sources, and some architectural elements. Let me resume this investigation for you. The life of Sheikh Nusret is documented by funerary inscription. As you can see in the mausoleum, the cenotaph of Sheikh Nusret is the one at the center. This central cenotaph bears a tombstone mentioning the name of Sheikh Nasreddin on one side. The shape of this stone, so is this one with this face with the name, the shape of the stone, the layout of the inscription on 4 lines, 4 short lines, and even its somehow awkward Nasri calligraphy belongs clearly to the late medieval period. The wooden cenotaph it is nowadays set in is a later, probably quite modern addition. As you probably know, in the medieval Islamic world, and more particularly in Anatolia, it was usual to separate separate funerary stela in 2 parts. One headstone bearing the name and one footstone bearing the date of the death or the burial of the deceased. In the mausoleum, no footstone can be are preserved. Nevertheless, in 2017, I could photograph another stone, which was hidden beneath the minbar of the mosque. And this stone is inscribed with a date, which reads 1777, that is 1375. The shape, dimensions, as you can see with the 2 pictures, and and the script of the two stones are quite similar. In my opinion, there is a high probability that this stone was associated to Sheikh Nusret's tomb and was preserved, even hidden in the mosque, after the transformation of the cenotaph in the modern period. This funerary inscription on 2 stones gives then a crucial clue to date the life of Sheikh Nusret during the 14th century, and to place his death in 1777-1375. This chronology is confirmed by a body of other clues to be found in documentary sources. Indeed, an exceptional corpus of 14 medieval vakfiyes, or endowment deeds, are related to the shrine. These documents are now preserved at the Başbakanlık Osmanlı Arşivleri in Istanbul and dated between 739, 1338 and 792, 1390. They were preserved in private hand until 2015, and unfortunately, during my last visit to the Başbakanlık Arşivleri, only the last vakfiye, so this one, was digitalized. However, according to the archive catalogue, the earliest vakfiye concerns the donation of land in a village close to Aksaray, where the Zawiya was built, for the profit of the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret. This document, established in 739, so that is 1338, constitutes then a terminus antiquem for dating the foundation of the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret. Whatever its architectural form might have been, a construction of the Zawiya before 1338 is consistent with the death of Sheikh Nusret in 1375. Finally, this last vakfi, as you can see here, established in 792, 1390, mentions that Sheikh Nasreddin Sheikh Nusret was dead as this in this date, confirming his death before 1390. So that also corresponds with the footstones that I just showed you. Thus, Sheikh Nusret lived during the 14th century, established a Zawiya in Aksaray. I'm sorry for the, okay, this is, established a Zawiya in Aksaray before 1338 and died most probably in 1375. So what are the traces of this first establishment? Architecturally, it is very difficult to attribute unequivocally some vestige to this first phase. The architecture of the mausoleum, as you can see here, with its 6 meters square plan and its cupola resting on pendentive with an octagonal drum, is uneasy to date precisely. Yet the mausoleum, originally freestanding before the adjunction of the storage room here and the minaret, is still the earliest structure preserved in the shrine. While similar 14th century structures are known, this quite basic plan and elevation may also have been erected as late as the 16th century. As we shall see, the interior was totally refurbished in the mid-19th century, and the displacement of Sheikh Nusret tombstones illustrates changes that even have affected the Saint tomb. Only an analysis of building archaeology may bring answers to the issue of dating the mausoleum. Unfortunately, as you can see, multiple restorations, including works done in the 1960s, have drastically transformed the fabric and unified the exterior aspect of the monument. In addition to the mausoleum, the loggia here, running along the north facade of the complex, also shows an intricate chronology of construction. The roof structure that one can see nowadays is obviously quite recent. Nevertheless, the large platform where public ceremonies are performed during the yearly pilgrimage to Sheikh Nusret tomb was constructed in 2 phases. As you can see on the screen, the eastern part of the platform, so this part, is constructed in ashlar with fine quality limestone blocks supporting the 2 first columns. The western part, so the part after here, as you can see here, is a modern extension constructed in concrete. This obviously recent addition are not precisely dated, but probably very recent. The eastern part of the platform, however, with this stone masonry, so this part, correspond exactly in length to the length of the mausoleum's north facade. Like the mausoleum, dating this platform precisely between the 14th and the 16th century is challenging. I mean, there is very few, this is very common architecture and with a few ornamental elements that could help us to really precise the datation. However, this platform constitutes an extension of the mausoleum, and the 2 were most probably built together. 2 other architectural elements constitute probably the only architectural traces definitely attributable to the late medieval Zawiye. These are 2 wooden imposts that you can see here, located between the Muqarnas capital and the modern roof of the loggia. These 2 pieces of wood, here you have the other one, are ornated with engraved geometric figures, largely damaged by the wind. Nevertheless, several comparisons can be done with similar ornated imposts, as was done by Emine Akin also in their article in the Vakeflag der Gisse. So we can compare this impost with 2 other buildings from the late medieval period in this very region of Zile. The first case is an Ilkhanid mosque built in the village of Dimorta, located some 20 kilometers to the east of Sheikh Nusret's lodge. And here you can see one example of the impost with the exact same shape and comparable engraving on the side of the impost. The second building is even more interesting for us. It is a Zawiye founded in the village of Bulutlu, here, and it is 25 kilometers to the south of Aksaray Sheikh Nusrettin. This Zawiye consisted in a domed mausoleum built in Ribblestone here, attached to a wooden structure. To my knowledge, this is the only wooden structure Zawiya from the medieval period which is preserved, and it is dated thanks to its waqfiyah from 694, 1295. So, are the 2 imposts preserved in the north loggia of Sheikh Nusret of Sheikh Nusret Logia, a witness of a wooden structure corresponding to the first building there, it is unfortunately impossible to confirm this with few clues like this impost, but the question deserves to be addressed. As you can see, the material evidence of the first structure of Sheikh Nusret Dervish Lodge is scarce and uneasy to interpret. Despite the poverty of medieval architectural remains, epigraphy and documentary sources clearly point out a construction of the Zawiya during the first half of the 14th century. While the material history of this complex is uncertain for the medieval period, documentary and literary sources from the second half of the 14th century clearly disclose the significance of the Zawiya and the charisma of its founding sheikh. Firstly, like all pious foundations, Zawiya were financed thanks to the Waqf system. The unique corpus of 14 Waqfiyeh established between 1338 and 1390 for the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret enable us to reconstitute the economic roots of the institution. This endowment deeds describes the donation or acquisition of lands for the benefits of the lodge during the reign of the Eretnids and their successors, Kadi Burhaneddin. This period, still understudied, follows the collapse of the Ilkhanid Empire and precedes the final establishment of Ottoman rule in the region in the early 15th century. The vacuum of power between 1335 and the 1390s contribute to the emergence of new local economic actors, such as local emirs or dervish communities. Moreover, the absence of central authority has favored important changes in the land holding system. During these decades, many properties, land and real estate, were converted into Waqf by their owners, partly because this system of Waqf offers a guarantee to landowners for keeping their wealth and revenues in a time of great instability. Basing on an analysis of medieval Waqfiyeh and of the first Ottoman tax register established in 859-1455, I could demonstrate in my dissertation that the revenues of 60 to 70% of villages in this Zile region were attributed to Waqf. So that means that Waqf were capitalizing more than the half of the revenues of all of this region, I mean the land revenues. Among this Waqf, 90% were constituted for the support of Zawiyas, and most of them were established during the second half of the 14th century. In summary, Sufi institutions capitalized important amount of land and properties thanks to the Waqf system during the second half of the 14th century. With its 14 Waqfiyeh, the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret constitute a perfect example of this phenomenon. Then, some decades after the establishment of the lodge in the village of Aksaray in the second quarter of the 14th century, Sheikh Nusret and his descendants and the community of dervishes found themselves at the head of a wealthy estate. This economic wealth echoes the larger audience of the shrine. Indeed, the Waqf system was also a way to affirm alliances between the donors and the beneficiary, in our case, a Zawiya. For instance, among the donators of the Waqfiyeh of the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret, one can list a bey of Ordu in the Black Sea coast and a local emir, so that is this one, Amir Hadi ibn Ali, who is unfortunately unknown in other sources. The charisma of the sheikh and his descendants, that one can guess from reading documentary sources, is even more clearly expressed in the only historical chronicle of the region, written in the late 14th century. This chronicle is the Bazm Waraz. You can see the script captation of the edition by Kemal Rifat. And this Persian chronicle was written by Aziz ibn Ardashir Hastarabadi for Qadi Burhanuddin, who ruled central Anatolia between 1381 and 1398. So it is a very late 14th century text. In one passage relating the countless fighting opposing local emirs, this text mentions the son of Sheikh Nusrat, as you can see here, so Pesari Sheikh Nusrat, as a peace negotiator. Moreover, Hastarabadi specifies that the son of Sheikh Nusrat was the sheikh and spiritual guide of the Vilayet Danishmendiye that you have here. That is the whole region of northern Anatolia. This Vilayet of Danishmendiye corresponds to the territory of the Danishmendid in the 12th century. Thus, the Baz Murazm clearly reveals the larger audience of the Zawiye and the spiritual authority of its sheikh. This charisma of Sheikh Nusrat and his descendants and their implication in local politics is confirmed by two other Vakfiyes which unveil a local religious network developed around the Zawiye of Sheikh Nusrat. Indeed, the Zawiye of Sheikh Nusrat was not the only dervish lodge founded in the late medieval period in this Zile region. You can see on the map, here you can see the different Zawiye. I will present them briefly, and here are part of the dotation in different Vakfi documents. So at least 4 other Zawiyes were established between the mid-13th century and the 14th century in this very region of Zile. 2 Zawiye were built in the mid-13th century. The first one is the Zawiye of Sheikh Muinuddin, which is dated thanks to Vakfi documents. The actual building is, of course, a later one. I will come back to this one. And the second one is a Zawiye of Sheikh Salsal here, in also a small village, whose Vakfiyes bear the date of 661, 1263. The monument is only a very recent one. So these 2 Zawiyes were established before the Zawiye of Sheikh Nusrat in Aksaray in the second quarter of the 14th century. After the establishment of Sheikh Nusrat Dervish Lodge, 2 other Zawiyes were founded in the region. Firstly, a Zawiye was established by a Sheikh Eyluk here in the village of Kavajak, which is nowadays Yeşilçay, which is located approximately 14 kilometers to the southwest of the village of Sheikh Nusrat. Only a mausoleum restored in the 19th and early 20th century is preserved. Nevertheless, Bekir Haltendal, historian of Zile, mentions a certificate of proficiency, an ijazetname, as we call them in Ottoman, established in 777, that is 1376, for Sheikh Eyluk by the son of Sheikh Nusrat. Unfortunately, this document, held in private hands, seems to have vanished, and Altendal does not give any detail about the kind of knowledge that this diploma was authenticated. Nevertheless, it illustrates the religious authority of the Sheikh, of the descendant of Sheikh Nusrat in this very region. Secondly, a last Zawiye was established by Sheikh Yaqub here, a Sheikh named Sheikh Yaqub ibn Ahmad in the village of Tumi, which is nowadays known as Karashay. Nothing is left from this Zawiye except this very simple tomb, which is still visited by local Alevi communities. Interestingly enough, this saint character was like Sheikh Eyluk, related to Sheikh Nusrat. This is suggested by the Nisba al-Nusrati, that complete his name in the Vakfiye of the Zawiye established in 719, 1388. In the local context of the Zile region, the Zawiya is only located 30 kilometers west to Sheikh Nusreddin, the Nisba al-Nusrati it seems quite clear that this Nisba al-Nusrati reflects a close relation with the Sheikh of Aksara. This true example, the Zawiya of Sheikh Eyluk and Sheikh Yaqub, evidently illustrates the religious authority of Sheikh Nusret and its descendant, at least at a local scale. Between the second quarter of the 14th century and the establishment of Ottoman rule in the early 15th century, the Dervish Lodge of Sheikh Nusret has become a major shrine with a regional influence, even though the architectural remains don't reflect this importance. Like many other cases in this region during the same period, Sufi networks were not necessarily structures like tariqa, but local affiliation and hereditary transmission seems to have played a more important role. Religious authority of its sheikh, starting with the founding saint buried in Aksaray in 1375, goes hand in hand with the capitalization of land revenues and alliances with actors of the local political and military scene. In the specific context of the second half of the 14th century, the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret constitute, like many other examples, what Khalil ibn al-Jak has once named an autonomous enclave. The Ottoman conquest of the region, starting under Bayezid I and finally accomplished under Mehmed I after the Ottoman defeat of Ankara in 1402, has drastically changed the regional settings. We shall see now, in the second part, how the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret adjusted to the situation and developed under the Ottoman. So this is, the second part. To my knowledge, the earliest Ottoman document mentioning the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret is the first tax register established in 1455. The incomes of Sheikh Nusret's lodge, as it appears in this Tarikh Defter, partly correspond to the information one can find in the 14th century Vakfi. More importantly, in this very section, which is the one related to the village of Aksaray, we learn that the Vakf of the Zawiya, as you can see here, so the Vakf of the Zawiya was under the responsibility of Sheikh Abd al-Hanan, son of Sheikh Sayyidi Hassan. Very few is known about this Sheikh Abd al-Hanan, except that he was the grandson of Sheikh Nusret himself, according to one of the Waqfiyah and to an hagiography of Sheikh Nusret written in Turkish during the Ottoman period. The writing of such a hagiography confirms the major impact of the shrine in this very region. The Vita of Sheikh Nusret is known from one manuscript, now kept at the Süleymaniye Library in Istanbul, with the number Laleli 1503. This text, entitled Menakib Name Sheikh Nusret Khorasani, according to the catalogue, but only bears the title Menakib Hevliya here. This text, this text is very difficult to date. The manuscript bears no date, and we don't know the author of this Menakib Name. Dating both the copy and the text is then an only partially solved question. Nevertheless, terminus postquem and antequem can be defined. The text ends with the death of Sheikh Abd al-Hanan, who was in charge of the Zawiya in 1455, as I just said. The text was then written after the second half of the 15th century, or after 1455. It was also certainly written before the second half of the 18th century. Indeed, a Waqf seal of Sultan Mustafa III is stamped on the first folio. Dating the text more precisely is difficult. Nevertheless, a foundation tale written in this Vita, which I will turn to later, is partially quoted by Evliya Çelebi. It seems reasonable to suggest that This menakibnameh, if not the exact copy of the Suleymaniye, but the text itself was the source of Evliya Çelebi and was then composed before the mid-17th century. Finally, the copy stylistic and linguistic characteristic could correspond to a large date between the 1450s and the 1650s. The menakibnameh of Sheikh Nusrat starts with the birth of the Sheikh, son of Padishah Khurasan, and continues with 5 chapters explaining the mystical path of the Sheikh. And I will not will not talk about this part today. I would prefer to focus on the tale of foundation of the Zawiya, which start in this folio, and can be divided into 3 moments. In one first part, both the local roots of the Sheikh and its prestige as a reputed saint is stressed. Indeed, this anecdote recounts how Sheikh Nusrat and his 44 followers stop on the top of a mountain named Agda, which is exactly here, between Kazabad and Artukabad. So this is 2 large plains close to the Zile region. From this mountain, the saint Sheikh Nusrat sent all his followers finding a stone to sit and to enter into Sema. With this metaphor of the spread of dervishes, the author of the menakibnameh brings the regional and local geography together. In fact, while the nisbah of the disciple, as you can see here, indicating the origin from Gilan to Khorasan, Hindustan, etc., evokes the Sheikh charisma, which would be followed by disciples from all over the Islamic 8 world. As a contrary, the place that this disciples went to visit are very local. Some are visiting Çorum, Amasya, so closer place, but even closer villages, including Aksaray itself. So this is the first part of the foundation tale. The second part starts when the Sheikh moved from Agda to a place whose description in the text perfectly fit with the place of Aksaray, where the Dervish lodge is actually standing. Here, the mystic figure of Khidr, Hazar Peygamber in the text, appears and tells Sheikh Nusrat to find a place with a miraculous mulberry tree, half green and half burned, but still giving fruits. The legend of this tree is the one related also by Evliya Çelebi. Finally, the text tells us how Sheikh Nusrat gains the support of the locals who become his followers, it says clearly Murid Oldular, and bring together properties, Jem Eydup Mulklar Olup, and Sheikh Nusrat then ordered the locals to transform the property into Waqf, Waqf al-Sundi. The text narrates then how the dervishes and Sheikh Nusrat himself went from village to village and stayed there for 1 day or more. And it is very interesting to see when one compares the list of villages visited by the shrines that you can see here, and the incomes of the Waqf as it can be established from the Waqfiyeh and from the Tarikh Defter. This comparison shows how the menakibnameh is partly, I mean it's a complex text, I'm only talking about the last folios, is partly an attempt to legitimize property acquired 1 or 2 centuries earlier. On a total of 5 villages mentioned in the menakibnameh, 4 are attested in 14th century Waqfiyah and 3 of them in the Tarikh Defter of the mid-15th century. This issue of legitimacy in Ottoman Vita related to medieval saints should be put in the larger context of hagiography writing in the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the 15th and 16th century. Many of these texts, either called menakibnameh or vilayatnameh, were written then, and they do not show the same attitude towards land's property, relation to the lodge as central institution, or to the political power. The vilayatnameh of Othman Baba, for instance, written in 1483 and studied by Halil Inalcık, shows a totally different discourse, rejecting those sheikh who accumulated properties and were dependent of the Sultan's gift. an attitude opposed to the discourse developed in the Menakibnameh of Sheikh Nusret. On the other hand, the Makalati Sayyid Harun, composed in the mid-16th century, recounts the foundation of the city of Sheikh Shahir by Sayyid Harun. This text presents many parallels with the Menakibnameh Sheikh Nusret. Both of them are short texts, and both includes an attempt to legitimize the Waqf dotation of the shrine. As Karl Ernst has argued, writing in a geography follow a political agenda. In the case of Sayyid Harun, the text is an attempt to secure the Waqf dotation. And I quote here Fatih Bayram, who studied this text, is an attempt to, quote, defend the followers of Sayyid Harun in the skeptical environment in which many Sufis found themselves in the mid-16th century, end of quote. The same can probably be said about the followers of Sheikh Nusret. Thus, the Menakibnameh of Sheikh Nusret constitutes a unique literary source to understand how this wealthy Zaviyeh, established in the 14th century, managed to integrate new politic, economic, and religious networks under the Ottoman. A closer look to the first part of the geography should definitely bring more elements regarding the devotional background of the community at the time of the writing of the text. While the Menakibnameh Sheikh Nusret definitely illustrate issues of legitimacy, is it possible to link the writing of this Menakibnameh to the material and architectural history of the shrine? As Zainab Yurekli has demonstrated, the writing of hagiography and architectural patronage of Sufi shrine in the early modern period are two processes very often closely intricated, a process that she brilliantly resumed with the expression writing down the feats and setting up the scene. Of course, the case of Sheikh Nusret differs from major shrines developed under elite or even imperial patronage, such as the Safavid shrine of Ardabil or the shrine of Hajj Bektash in Anatolia. No evidence of external patronage is documented in the complex of Sheikh Nusret. Nevertheless, I would like to share one hypothesis that may help us to date more precisely both the Menakibnameh and the mausoleum. This reflection started with two observations that place Sheikh Abd al-Hanan, the grandson of Sheikh Nusret, at another point of the history of the shrine. First, the Menakibnameh of Sheikh Nusret end with the death and the burial of Sheikh Abd al-Hanan. On the other hand, Sheikh Abd al-Hanan is the father of the two other persons buried in the mausoleum. So you can see the two tombstones. They are Sheikh Abd al-Hanan's daughter named Sihat and his son Sayyid Muhammad. Could we suppose that these two heirs of Sheikh Abd al-Hanan, great-grandson and granddaughter of Sheikh Nusret, commissioned the writing and or the building of the mausoleum? The hypothesis is appealing, but once again, the material evidence of the complex of Sheikh Nusret is not of much help to confirm this idea. Here again, the footstone of the tomb of the children of Sheikh Abd al-Hanan are missing. But we can estimate the life in the second part of the 15th century and early 16th century. This date could coincide with the writing of the Menakibnameh. Moreover, one discrete element in the mausoleum fabric may argue for dating this construction not right after the death of Sheikh Nusret in the 14th century, but more probably in the 15th or early 16th century. I mean by this the presence, as you can see here, it's quite difficult to see because of the recent restoration, but you see that some layers of bricks are inserted into the masonry, the rubble stone masonry of the mausoleum. This is visible on the east facade here and on the south facade. The introduction of brick layers in ashlar masonry is frequent in early Ottoman architecture, as most of you probably know, in western part of Anatolia. But this technique was only introduced during the 15th century in northern central Anatolia, where before we find masonry of cobblestone, but without any introduction of brick layers. Nevertheless, one should keep prudent and further investigation need to be done in this direction. The introduction of Abd al-Hanan children's cenotaph inside the founder mausoleum could also have occurred at a later date. The material history of the shrine of Sheikh Nusret during the Ottoman classical age, so to speak, is still quite foggy. Nevertheless, the writing of Menakib Nameh during this period and the efforts made by the author of this text to legitimize the property acquired during the 14th century illustrate how this medieval shrine and its community were adapting to the new political, economical, and of course religious context. If the details of this history are still hidden to the modern historian, the account of Evliya Çelebi in the mid-17th century clearly demonstrates that this was a success. As we shall see, to finish briefly this presentation, because I'm running out of time, a new phase of reorganization of the shrine took place in a very different context in the 19th century. Here. So contrary to the medieval and early modern period, we dispose of few documentary or literary sources for this late period, but more material evidence. During this period, major works were undertaken at the shrine of Sheikh Nusret. The wooden mosque was rebuilt in the mid-19th century and probably replaced the mosque mentioned by Evliya Çelebi. So this is the inside of the 19th century wooden mosque. A fountain was added to the shrine by two women descendants of Sheikh Nusret, and this is known by this other inscription that I found also hidden beneath the minbar of the mosque. And more importantly, this fountain belongs to a larger renovation plan that had an important impact on the mausoleum itself. As you can see on the screen, in the mid-19th century, a very important and fascinating program of wall paintings were added inside the mausoleum. These paintings cover the four walls of the mausoleum, the pendentives here, and partly the cupola. The iconographic program combines paradisiac themes, esoteric knowledge, and Sufi iconography, together with representation of specific sanctuaries and common calligraphic cartouches, as you can see here, with the name of the fourth Rashidun Caliphate on the pendentives. I will go a little bit more rapidly on this part, but here on the south you can see a depiction of the Kaaba with 12 dervish arts. Here a more complex iconography with the representation of what is labeled by inscription 8 Paradise. On the north wall, you have this heavenly mosque, which is not clearly identified. And more importantly, you have this small depiction here above the door, the entrance door of the mausoleum, which this is only a guess, but may represent the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusret itself with its enclosure and its bucolic context, as you can see the close here. And finally, the east wall combines two different elements, and the most interesting is this Canopy Mausoleum, which is labeled as the tomb of Ahmad al-Rifai. This ambitious wall paintings program poses many questions regarding its iconography that I should study into more details in the future. According to the inscription painting on the east wall, these paintings belongs to a restoration, Tamir, that you can see here, commissioned by Ibrahim Dedezadeh, unknown in other sources, unfortunately, in 1272, that is 1855-56. These paintings were also signed here by another person, which is Harabzadeh Emin Usta, that you can see with another date, 1275, 1858-59. And Harabzadeh Emin Usta is also known as Zileli Emin Usta. And this helps us to clearly date to clearly establish the date when this painting were added to the mausoleum between 1272 and 1275. Harabzadeh Emin Usta, or Zileli Emin Usta, is a painter, or most probably a workshop of painters, known for many paintings program in northern Anatolia during the 19th century. His work has been studied by Bahat Alman or Gönül Canday, for instance, and include major realizations such as the Mosque of Kahraman Mustafa in Merzifon or the Shadurvan of the Beyazid complex in Amasya. In the region of Zile, where this painter was apparently from, several zawiya and mausoleum were decorated with wall paintings. Two are of particularly interest regarding the complex of Sheikh Nusret. The first one is the zawiya of Sheikh Muhinuddin that you can see here. So the first zawiya established in the region. And you have similar representation, including the representation of the Kaaba here. But more important maybe, and lesser known and very interesting, is the decorative program of the Javier of Sheikh Eyluk. The sheikh that, to remind you, have received an ijazatnameh from the son of Sheikh Nusret in 1376. Only the mausoleum is preserved with a particular roofing, but all the walls are painted and covered with Ottoman ex-voto that you can see here, and that one should definitely be studying one day before they disappear. And in this iconographic program, we find very close similarities in all of with this depiction of the Canopy Mausoleum here, but also all the symbolic elements, the Sufi elements in the iconography are very similar between the mausoleum of Sheikh Eyluk and the one of Sheikh Nusret. Then, the painting of Sheikh Nusret Mausoleum belongs to a larger group of works attributed to Zileli Emin Usta. Interestingly enough, three zaviyas that were parts of the networks established during the late medieval period were again reunited in the 19th century by sharing a common iconographic program. The proximity is even more true, as I said, for the zawiya of Sheikh Nusrat and the mausoleum of Sheikh Eyluk that shares very exactly similar motifs. As we have seen previously, Sheikh Eyluk received this diploma from Sheikh Nusret and were part of the same local network in the 14th century. More interestingly, Sheikh Eyluk is also mentioned in the Menakib-Nameh of Sheikh Nusret and was present at the burial of the saint during the Ottoman period, in this text written during the Ottoman period. While some gaps in the chronology should not be forgotten, the two sanctuaries were integrated into common local Sufi networks from the 14th century to the 19th century. To conclude, the complex material, economic, and religious history of the zawiya of Sheikh Nusret can only be comprehended in a longue durée perspective. While the architectural remains are still difficult to clearly understand, and while the chronology of construction are still escaping to us in its details, the unique textual documentation related to the shrine enlightens the significance of the shrine over 5 centuries, between its foundation in the 14th century until the late 19th century. As we have seen, the shrine of Sheikh Nusret was a major economic actor of the region during the late medieval period, and was at the center of local Sufi network. The Ottoman hagiography, despite the fact that it is difficult to date precisely, confirms the influence of this rural dervish lodge and should be understood in the larger context of the quest for legitimacy pursued by the Zawiya community 1 or 2 centuries after the foundation of the shrine. Finally, Sheikh Nusret was again the object of major works, including these fascinating paintings in the late 19th century. On a cross-methodological level, I hope that this presentation have illustrated the interest of cross-cutting and of combining architectural remains and epigraphy and textual sources. Such a perspective of history of material culture enable us to integrate lesser monumental and lesser known remains, such as the Zawiya of Sheikh Nusrat, in our understanding of the bigger picture of the history of Sufism in medieval and Ottoman Anatolia. While the architectural remains of Sheikh Nusrat does not bring much to the history of the architecture of dervish lodges, the unique textual documentation related to the shrine contributes to document several important of the history of Sufism in this region, like the economic roots of such institution, and also the importance of local Sufi networks built in the late medieval period that redefines the sacred topography, and how this sacred topography was also partly perpetuated until the later period. I thank you for your attention and I apologize for having been a little bit longer.
Thank you, Maxime. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I neglected to say at the beginning that you were invited to write your questions in the chat function to the address indicated, but hopefully you saw it, and I saw already that there are questions. Just allow me a second or two to find them and share them one by one with Maxime Durocher, time permitting. So. So if I may, I'll begin with the first question. It's from Hassan Karatash. He says, I always found it curious that there are so many documents about Şeyh Nusret in Ali Emiri collection in Başbakanlık Osmanlı arşivleri. Do you have a theory? I joined a bit late and perhaps I missed it. If I did, I'm sorry.
As far as I know, all of these documents were kept into private hands in the village until 2015. That was local historians are saying. And it is also very interesting how this local saint, how the history is perpetuated until now. For instance, a family living in this village claimed to be the descendant of the Muteveli of the shrine. And there was the one in charge of the document. But there are also the one that are buried in the closer place of the mausoleum. So these documents were given in 2015 to the Başbakanlık and were kept into private hands. And I can say that this is the case of many documents at least in this region. During my research for the dissertation, I found many cases of such documents still in private hands.
Thank you. Shall I then? Yes. The second question is from Ayfer Karakaya Stamp. She says, thank you for this great presentation. Do we know which Ojaks the Alevis living in the area are affiliated with?
I don't know. I didn't research about what, I didn't search for this, but what was very interesting for a short anecdote, that this, all of this, especially the mausoleum of Sheikh Salsal and the one of Sheikh Yaqub, so the two very modern, simple structures that I've shown you, was showed to me by a local Alevi from another village. And when it was at the beginning of the dissertation, and when I first visited these places, I say, okay, this is modern stuff not belonging to my research. And it was only after doing research in the archives that I could relate these two very scarce remains with medieval documents. But in fact, I mean, this topography is still very lively in the Alevi communities around there, but I don't have any clue to share more. I apologize for this.
Okay, and Ayfer again has a follow-up question. Any local oral traditions concerning Sheikh Nusret, unless this was mentioned during the first 15 minutes of the lecture that I missed. So maybe you.
No, I mean, there is a lot, but most of this oral tradition were also registered by local historian. And now as far as I understood, the village of Sheikh Nasreddin is more a Sunni villages, which I mean, one should ask, I mean, different communities to have different oral traditions that can complete or compete each other.
Thank you. Now a question from Zeynep Oktay Uslu. She says, could you inform us on the Sufi affiliations of Sheikh Nusret and the doctrinal position of the hagiography, whether or not he is linked to other major dervishes in this work?
So the Sufi doctrine of Sheikh Nusret himself is very impossible to tell. I mean, we don't have any document for the 14th century for the life of Sheikh Nusret. The only thing we have is his Ottoman hagiography. The thing is, I will need, and maybe Zeynep can be the one to, but help to clearly replace this hagiography into the religious history, which is not my area of my field of expertise. The only thing I could say is like there is the different anecdote of this mystical path, and the text also relates how the Sheikh Nusret went on the night journey to the Kouye Kaf. And this is the text is structured with different anecdotes, and you have always what is the source of this anecdote. And one that come very often in the sources is a Sheikh Bayrami, but Buz Bayrami, and this is Sheikh Bayram. It's not Hajj Bayram, but it's called Sheikh Bayram in the text. So this is something I have to go into more details, and I would need help for this, of course. About the other person, Sarah Saltouk is mentioned at the end of the Menakib Name, coming to the burial, and local saint mostly.
If I may just follow it up, is there evidence for the Sufi affiliations, if any, of the other lodges in the vicinity, the lodges that you showed us?
No, the thing is, there is
from any period, yeah.
No, I mean, I don't have. This is the only case which I really have, documentation until the Ottoman period. In the late medieval period, it's really hard to have this Sufi affiliation because this structure were not really existing in the late 14th and early 15th century, except for one. We have one very interesting group of Rifai Xavier in the north of Amasya, so not so too far, I mean, maybe 50, 70 kilometers from there. And here we have a really Rifai lineage starting with Ahmadi Kuchek and two of his sons establishing Xavier in this very region. In the region of Zile, no, what is, in my opinion, very interesting is to see how Sufism in this also particular late medieval context were structurating in local networks with an importance of genealogy and hereditary transmission of charisma, and with local relation with other Xavier, which were not included, at least in the 14th century, in larger Sufi affiliation. Maybe it came later, but for instance, if it had a very important affiliation in the 17th century, Evliya Çelebi would have told this. The only thing he tells is like Sheikh Nusret is one contemporary of Hacı Bektaş and came from Khorasan, which is what the information one can read in the Menakib Name. But it doesn't say anything about him being a disciple of Hacı Bektaş, and yes, and we don't have any trace of this origin from Central Asia before the Ottoman period.
Thank you. Okay, I'll read another question. It comes from Şeyma Yeşil Çavdar Sekman. She writes, thank you for this presentation. What was your main motivation to study Sheikh Nusret among many other sheikhs?
The thing is, I came across this amazing complex, which is, I mean, it doesn't seem maybe very rich compared to other complex, but it is very, very interesting. When I was largely working on the establishment of Xaviers and Tekes in this region, through how these Xavier were, on one hand, renovating the sacred topography, but also were also economic and social actors that have played an important role in the transformation of this region of Anatolia, and more particularly of the countryside, between the 14th and the 6th and the 15th century. And this is when coming to this with this research that I visited Nusrettin sanctuary and got interested, very fascinated by this this place.
Thank you. Now, oops. I just wanted to read a new question from Oya Pancaroğlu. She writes, do we know when the minaret was built? Would it help to understand the 19th century transformations of the complex? Or is it a 20th century addition to confirm the Jami identification of the prayer hall?
The only thing we know about the minaret is that the brick minaret that you can see now was replacing a wooden one in the 1960s. What I can say it was probably built in the late 19th century when the mausoleum was transformed, because the storage room was also closing one of the windows of the mausoleum, the west window, and this is also where the basics of the minarets is now. And if I can show you, this is the only wall where the original window was also recovered by painting. So this one. So this is, here you had a window that was opening on the outside, and when they built the storage room, they closed the window. So when did they close? When they did the painting, or did they close before? It's hard to date, but it's not before the 19th century. And the actual minaret is, yeah, most probably also a transformation of the 1960s to input prayer into this this village.
Let's just wait for a minute or so for more questions. I've come to the list and the end of the list that I have before me. Maybe others have questions. So while we wait, you might have explained this and I might have missed it. But it struck me that all these that multiple lodges in this area had these wall paintings added in the 19th century. Do we know anything about the larger context? Was it the same people who kind of,
I mean,
who were involved in either making the wall paintings or commissioning them? Do we know anything?
Actually, I went too rapidly on this part, but yes, I mean, all of these paintings are attributed to the same workshop, the one of Zileli Minusta, which is known to have been very productive in the region. So he has done painting. I mean, the workshop more than the painter has done a lot of paintings in Amasya, Merzifon, Tokat. You have two Konak in Tokat, the private buildings that are also decorated with these paintings. So it is a particularity of all the region. What is interesting is also that you have he adapted the representation to the context, and what should be more. I mean, I should go into more deep research about the iconography and the relation to Sufism, because this could give us a lot of clues regarding the Sufi affiliation or devotional practices of these Zaviers and how they were still related to each other in the 19th century.
Thank you.
To add rapidly something, we have different almanac or salname from the late 19th century of this region. And two of them, written in 1886 and 1890, mention actually all of these 5 zawiyas that I've told you about, the 5 zawiyas built in the region of Zileh in the late medieval period, as being the most important zawiya of the region in the 19th century. So you see there is this continuity, which have a lot of gap to fill in between, and they, most of them, the one which are preserved, so the mausoleum of Shaykh Luke, the one in Zileh and the one in Sheikh Strait, present this painting. So what about the two other one? Unfortunately, the building have vanished probably in the early 20th century.
Thank you. So it seems we have come to the end of the questions. Thank you, Maxime, for a very interesting, very rich talk.
Thank you very much.
So we hope we actually also host you one day in bodily form.
No, I hope to come to visit the center, of course, and to also continue research about this Menachem Name to get closer to the datation, and for this I need to go doing research in the different archive in Istanbul, and also to go back to the region of Zileh.
Thank you. So with that, we end the session, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming and your questions.